Natalia is currently a postdoc at Harvard, working with Samuel Gershman and Fiery Krishman. And she also received her PhD from Stanford University in 2020, advised by Hyo Guan, whom we all heard from last week. And super excitingly, she also recently accepted a faculty position at Princeton to start in a few years. Congrats. And her work focuses on learning from and about other people, as well as the dynamics of human collaboration. And in addition to her amazing work, she's also known as the science sketcher. So basically, she creates these wonderful portraits of scientists alongside their work. And if you hadn't had the chance to check them out, I totally recommend it. They're both really beautiful and informative. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalia Vélez.
Thanks, Allison. That was lovely. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you today. Just I guess a quick note about presenting. I hope that this can be a lively discussion. So if you have any questions during the talk, please don't hesitate to pipe up. Okay, so let's get started. So life is a series of choices. For example, today you woke up and you decided what to wear, what to have for breakfast, what to work on first. And then in the middle of your busy day, you chose to come to this talk instead of doing something else. So thank you for doing that. Cognitive scientists often study decision-making in contexts where a single person makes decisions in isolation. But humans don't learn, plan, and make decisions alone. Many of our decisions are in some way influenced by other people. For example, you're probably here because you got an email from Allison. We can also learn a lot from observing other people's choices. In fact, many of the insights that we can gain through social learning would be difficult, if not outright dangerous, to learn through trial and error alone. For example, not many of us could discover that oysters are delicious or figure out when they are safe to eat. So how exactly do we learn from observing other people's choices? Well, the simplest thing that we can do is copy them. And this form of social learning is ubiquitous among animals. Everybody copies. Ants copy, bees copy, minnows copy, even animals that lead solitary lives like octopi copy when they have the chance to do it. And by observing and copying others' choices, we can gradually learn what's valuable and who's a reliable source of information. So for example, if I tend to like the restaurants that my friend picks out, I may pay more attention the next time that she decides where to eat. So on the surface, it seems that we can learn a lot from other people's choices by tracking their reliability and their accuracy. However, the information that we get from other people is rarely this opaque. So for example, if we get bad advice, we can not only detect that it's wrong, but we can also try to figure out why. So for example, was this person overly optimistic? Were they missing critical information? Were they maybe trying to lead me astray? Beneath the surface, other people's choices have this rich causal structure. Choices are a product at one level of the chooser's mind, such as her knowledge and preferences. So for example, if a friend recommends a particular restaurant, I might infer that she enjoys the food there and place more weight on her recommendation based on her knowledge of local restaurants. At another level, choices also reflect the chooser's background and the communities to which they belong. So for example, if I saw somebody order oysters in the Bay Area, where I just left, I might think that they're relatively well off and fancy. And there's nothing inherent about oysters that would lead me to that intuition. But instead, how we interpret others' choices is often situated within a particular time and place. If I instead saw this in a place where oysters are cheap and plentiful, like Virginia, where I live now, I might think nothing of this choice. And if I lived in industrial area England, like Charles Dickens, I might even associate oysters with abject poverty. And as I'll argue later in this talk, we don't just interpret other people's choices in isolation, but we also take into account relationships and statistical regularities between individuals. So how do we get so much information from something as simple as another person's choice? Well, my work builds on this framework that I call inferential social learning, and that you most likely heard about from Hyo last week. The basic idea behind social learning is that learners recover the meaning that underlie others' actions, like, for example, their choices, by operating this powerful inference engine over structured representations of the physical world, of other minds, and of interactions between the two. And by operating over these representations, learners can draw rich inferences that go far beyond the observed data. So for example, if a teacher demonstrates that a toy plays music, children not only learn that the toy plays music, but they also infer that it's the toy's only function, because if there had been additional functions, then a knowledgeable and helpful teacher would have shown them. My work builds on this framework in a few ways. First, we can expand the scope of the inputs that humans use to guide their learning. And in particular, my work examines how learners use observations of others' choices and their explicitly stated preferences, that is, the things that they say they like, to recover information about the world and about the people within it. Second, we can expand the range of representations that are contained within this theory. And in particular, my work looks at how learners draw these inferences by considering not just individual minds, but also the social world, so relationships and regularities between people. And finally, by expanding the representations contained within this theoretical framework, we can also expand the range of problems that we can apply it to. And in particular, my work looks at how children and adults use these inferences to discover rewards in the environment, and also to learn about new people that they encounter. And I use a variety of different methods to study these questions, including behavioral studies with children and adults, computational modeling, and neuroimaging using fMRI. So today I'm going to walk you through 3 lines of work. So in the first part of this talk, we're going to look at how humans use observations of others' choices to discover rewards, and in particular, how they combine their own incomplete knowledge of the environment with imperfect advice from others. In the second part of this talk, we'll look at how children and adults use others' preferences to learn about new people they encounter. And finally, time permitting, I'll tell you a little bit about how we've been building on this in my postdoc and beyond. So let's get started. So we don't just learn from totally knowledgeable and helpful teachers. We also have a lot to learn from people whose knowledge is incomplete but complementary to our own. And in this study, we asked whether adults use inferences about other minds to recover the meaning underlying imperfect social information. So first, I'm going to walk you through the task setup. So in this study, we had participants play with this deck of cards that had point values between 1 and 8. On each trial, we shuffled the cards and drew 2 cards with different values at random. One card was visible to the participant, and the other card was hidden from them. And so on each trial, participants could choose to stay and keep whatever points are in the visible card, or switch and take whatever points are in the hidden card. And the goal of this game is to win the most points. So if you were to see this card, how many of you would switch? Show of hands. Awesome. This one? Great. This one? It's not always so straightforward, thanks, but luckily participants didn't have to do this task on their own. They also received advice from an advisor who saw some subset of the cards and recommended whether they should stay or switch. So the advisor is this little red character here. So for example, in this case, if the advisor tells you to switch, you might feel more confident in doing so. So in this first study, we manipulated how much information the advisor had about the cards. So we presented participants with 3 within subjects conditions. At one extreme, the advisor could see no cards, that's this none condition. In this case, the advisor selected advice at random, and so their advice was completely uninformative. At the other extreme, the advisor could see both cards and deterministically recommended the better of the 2 cards, and so this advisor was always right. In the critical condition, the advisor could only see the card that was hidden from the participant. And this is important because now the participant and the advisor are each looking at a different card and they're both equally ignorant. So in this condition, we modeled the advisor's advice based on what participants do on average in a pilot task where they play this game on their own. And so here I'm showing you different values of the hidden card on the x-axis and how likely the advisor is to tell participants to switch on the y-axis. And what you can see is that the advisor's advice is generally helpful. So as the value of that hidden card increases, the advisor is more likely to tell participants to switch. So the advisor generally does its best, but its best is not enough. The advisor knows just as little as the participant does, and so following this advice doesn't guarantee that participants will make better decisions. On each trial, participants knew exactly how much information the advisor had about the cards. And so the question that we're asking here is not whether people can infer the advisor's knowledge, it's whether they use this advice at all and whether there's any benefit in taking advice when the person providing it has incomplete knowledge. First, I'm going to show you how well participants did at this game. So we have each of the three conditions on the x-axis and participants' total earnings by the end of the task on the y-axis. And what you can see is participants generally do better as the advisor has access to more information. Critically, they do better when the advisor can only see the card that's hidden from the participant compared to when the advisor can see no cards at all. And so participants benefit even from this imperfect advice. Now let's see how participants use this advice to guide their choice behavior. So I'm going to show you here different values of the card that's visible to the participant on the x-axis and how often they switched on the y-axis. And so when the advisor can see both cards, you can see here that participants just tend to go with the advice. So when the advisor tells them to switch, which is this red curve here, participants tend to switch. And when the advisor tells them to stay, this blue curve here, participants tend to stay. On the other extreme, when the advisor can see no cards, participants tend to ignore the advice altogether and base their decisions solely on the card that's visible to them. And in the critical condition, when the advisor can only see the card that's hidden from the participant, participants don't just tune the advisor out entirely, but they also don't follow the advisor's advice indiscriminately. Instead, they combine their own knowledge of the cards with the advisor's advice to make decisions. So they don't just benefit from imperfect advice, they also flexibly adjust their use of advice based on the advisor's knowledge. The next question is how participants are doing this. And so far, these results are consistent with two possible strategies. One simple strategy is that participants might only care about what's on the surface, that is, whether the advisor is right or not. And we formalize this intuition in the accuracy model. So the accuracy model uses its observations to estimate the advisor's accuracy, and then it assigns a weight to the advice based on its beliefs about the advisor's accuracy. Another possibility is that participants are making these choices by considering what's beneath the surface, that is, the latent process that gave rise to the advice. And we formalize this intuition in the inference model. So the inference model works backwards from its observations to jointly infer how the advisor selects advice, that's the shape of this choice function, and what the advisor sees, that's a belief distribution over values of the hidden card. And then it compares the value of the visible card to the expected value of the hidden card to make decisions. Now, again, these two models make the exact same predictions in the experiment that you just saw, and so we then designed another study to tease the two apart. So in this study, participants were assigned to two between subjects conditions where they worked with advisors that were equally knowledgeable and equally accurate, but who differed in their strategy. So in this experiment, the advisor could only ever see the card that was hidden from the participant, but different advisors used this information in different ways. So some participants worked with a risky advisor. That's this solid line here. So the risky advisor tended to tell participants to switch and take the hidden card unless the value of the hidden card was really bad. Other participants worked with a conservative advisor. That's this dotted line here. So the conservative advisor tended to tell participants to stay and keep whatever's in the visible card unless the value of the hidden card was really good. So critically, our two models make different, both of these advisors are equally accurate. They recommend the better of the two cards on about 70% of trials, but the two models make different predictions about how participants should use this information. So even in the idealized case, where participants learned perfectly how the advisor selects advice, the accuracy model only cares about how often the two advisors are accurate. And since they're both equally accurate, it doesn't distinguish between the two advisors at all. So this is actually like two perfectly overlapping sets of curves. Whereas the inference model learns that each advisor generates the advice using a different latent process, and so it adjusts its use of the advice accordingly. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that the accuracy model predicts that there should be no difference between conditions, while the inference model predicts that participants should adjust based on the advisor's strategy. And again, both advisors are equally accurate, and accordingly, participants follow advice from both advisors at similar rates, and they also achieve similar earnings by the end of the task. However, they do this in different ways. So if we look at participants' choice behavior, we see that participants use advice from these two advisors differently, and overall, their choice behavior is better explained by a model that actively infers the latent process that gave rise to the advice compared to a simpler model that only cares about superficial properties of the advice, namely how often the advisor is accurate. So overall, we see that participants adapt their use of the advice based on the advisor's strategy, and they seem to do this by considering the latent process that gave rise to the advice. So as a kind of complementary evidence for this idea, we also asked participants to report this latent process explicitly. So at the end of the task, we gave them a post-test where they saw different values of the hidden card from the advisor's perspective, and they had to rate how likely the advisor was to tell them to switch based on that value of the hidden card. So again, here I'm showing you the ground truth. This is how each advisor actually selected advice. And if we look at participants' beliefs about how the advisor generates advice, the shape of the curves that they provided looks strikingly similar to the ground truth. So participants don't just use this latent structure to guide their choice behavior, they can also explicitly report it. So put together, I think this work provides evidence that we don't just take advice at face value by considering superficial properties like accuracy, but rather we can actively interpret it by reasoning about other minds and about the latent process that gave rise to that advice. I see this work at the intersection between two traditions within social cognition that have been largely separate from one another. On one hand, working cognitive development has explored how even young children can draw rich inferences by reasoning about other minds. This is a lot of the work that you heard about from Hyo last week. But we know less about how these inferences guide adaptive behavior and decision-making and about their neural implementation. On the other hand, reinforcement learning models have been productively applied to model how humans make decisions in social contexts and to tie the computations that underlie these decisions to their neural substrates. But in a recently published paper, I've argued that most existing work in this tradition has treated social information, like advice, as just another lean reward predictive cue. And it's missed a lot of the latent structure, like goals, beliefs, and strategy, that makes social information different from the kind of information that we gain through direct interaction with the environment. I believe that these two traditions have a lot to offer one another, and that by bridging the two, we might gain new avenues into studying the neural computations that support social learning. So just to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing in this space, in another study, we've been tying the predictions of this inference model, not just to choice behavior, but also to the potential neural substrates of these computations. So again, just as a reminder, the inference model makes two predictions that set it apart. It predicts that observers actively infer the value of hidden choice options, that is the value of that hidden card, and how the advisor selects advice. So here we tried to tie each of these predictions of the inference model to their neural substrates. So we had participants do this card game in the scanner with, I guess, one small difference, which is that before they went into the scanner, participants played a warm-up with a confederate, really an RA in our lab, who played the role of the advisor and was trained on the task alongside the participant. And after participants had did the scanner, and once participants went into the scanner, we switched out that human advisor with the simulated agent that we've been using so far. But even after the scanner session, the vast majority of our participants believed that the advice that they received in the scanner was coming from an actual human. Then participants did the card game inside the scanner, as well as an independent functional localizer, more on that in a few slides. And if we look at participants' behavior in the scanner task, overall, we replicate the patterns that we've seen before. As we link the predictions of the inference model to our fMRI data, I think it's important to take stock of what's been done before. So most existing work in fMRI of social learning has largely emphasized continuities between the computations that support learning from others and the computations that support learning through direct experience. And this work finds, for example, that neural signals that track rewards when we receive them ourselves also vicariously track the rewards that other people received. And in addition, past work has documented a range of signals that correlate with observable properties of social information, such as how often an advisor is accurate. Critically, in this study, we were interested in whether any regions track the value of options that aren't directly observed, but are instead inferred through advice. So can we find correlates of that, of the value of the hidden card? And if we look at participants' data, first we find some regions that track the value of the hidden card across all conditions. So these are, bilateral IPS. But we were most interested in looking at regions that selectively track this quantity in the hidden condition. That's because the hidden condition is the only condition where participants can neither just tune out the advice nor follow it indiscriminately. The hidden condition is the one case where participants have to combine their own knowledge with social information in order to make better decisions. And so we also find some regions that selectively track the value of the hidden card in the hidden condition. These include anterior and posterior cingulate and inferior frontal gyrus. So overall, we find some regions that track the value of this hidden choice option selectively when the advisor's information is imperfect. Next, we looked at whether we can find any regions that track abstract properties of the advice, so how the advisor selects advice. And for this, one candidate substrate for these regions is a network of regions called the theory of mind network. So these regions are robustly and selectively engaged when participants are reasoning about descriptions of other people's mental states compared to when they're reasoning about other non-mental representations like drawings or maps or books. In past work, including actually some of my undergrad work, kind of going full circle, people have also found that these regions track abstract, continuous properties of mental states, like the perceptual source of a belief, so whether somebody learned something by seeing evidence or hearing evidence, and the strength of the evidence supporting that belief. And so in this study in particular, we were also interested in whether these regions represent the advisor's knowledge. And we approached this question using an analysis called multi-voxel pattern analysis. I'm sure that many of you here are familiar with this analysis, but just to give you a quick refresher, the goal of this analysis is to test whether we can linearly decode features of our stimuli from the activity of neural populations. And asking which features can be linearly decoded gives us some insights into the kinds of representations that these populations support. So more concretely, we identified each of these regions within theory of mind network independently in each participant using a functional localizer, and then we extracted a pattern of activity from these regions on each trial. So this is a kind of activation of each voxel within this region in a single trial. Then we labeled each of these patterns according to the advisor's knowledge on the trial. So say, for example, this pattern came from a trial where the advisor could only see the hidden card, and we trained a classifier to discriminate between these trials. Then we tested the classifier on patterns from a held-out run. So for example, if you were to see this pattern, do you think this came from a trial where the advisor could see no cards? Show of hands. Both cards, show of hands. The hidden card, show of hands. Yeah, humans are also pretty good classifiers. And so there are two questions that we can address using this analysis. The first is whether these regions contain any information about the advisor's knowledge. That is, can we decode the advisor's knowledge based on these patterns of activation? So that's this metric called cross-validation accuracy on the y-axis. And just to calibrate expectations before I show you these results, generally the effect sizes that people have been able to find using MVPA and theory of mind network have been fairly small. So if you study, say, vision, this next plot is going to be a little bit underwhelming. But we do find evidence that, some evidence that two regions within theory of mind network contain information about the advisor's knowledge. That's posterior or precuneus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. We can also learn a lot about the representations contained within these regions, not just based on how much the classifier gets right, but also at what the classifier gets wrong. And we looked at this using something called the confusion matrix. So if you're not familiar with confusion matrices, they look like this. So we have the model predictions on the x-axis and the true labels for each condition on the y-axis. So intuitively, the x-axis shows us what the classifier thinks the advisor can see, and the y-axis shows us what the advisor can actually see. So trials along the diagonal are things that the classifier gets right, and trials off the diagonal are trials the classifier gets wrong. And the brighter each cell is, the more trials are contained within it. So if we look at the classifier's patterns of errors based on activity and precuneus, we can see that the modal responses of the classifier tends to assign each of these conditions a different label. And when it makes mistakes, those mistakes are evenly spread out within the remaining two conditions. So activity within precuneus clearly differentiates each of these three conditions from one another. If we look at the pattern of the confusion matrix based on BMPFC activity, we can see that even though the classifier achieves similar levels of performance in both regions, it makes a very different pattern of mistakes. So the representations contained within BMPFC, so if we see, so one thing really pops out from this plot, that the classifier is really good at picking out trials where the advisor can see none of the cards, but it lumps together trials where the advisor can see both cards and trials where the advisor can see the hidden card. So rather than containing distinct representations of the advisor's knowledge in each of these three states, the representations contained within BMPFC instead seem to lump together conditions where social information is irrelevant to choice and conditions where social information is relevant to choice. Okay, so overall, we see that regions within theory of mind network contain qualitatively distinct representations of the advisor's knowledge. So putting all of these studies together, beyond just learning from knowledgeable, helpful teachers, humans can learn even from imperfect advice, and they can adjust their use of advice flexibly based on the knowledge and strategy of the person providing it. Beyond just relying on superficial properties like accuracy, the ways in which people use advice are best described by a model that actively infers the latent process that gave rise to that advice, that is, what the person knows and how they select advice. And I think by bridging ideas from different traditions within social learning, particularly from cognitive neuroscience and cognitive development, I'm optimistic that we can open up new avenues into studying the neural bases of social learning. Are there any questions about this line of work before we move on to something completely different? Okay, cool.
Hey, actually, could
yeah.
I'm like still kind of like forming this question a little bit, but I'm curious if you explored like you know, this like gradient from like the DMPFC to the VMPFC, and if that gradient is representing this information differently. So yeah, I guess immediately I associate the VMPFC with like self kind of representations, and further you go up, the more other it gets. So curious about that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, okay, we can try to unpack like what that would look like. So one possibility is that the the representations of the card values may shift around depending on the advisor's knowledge, or that you might see kind of like different representations of like the card that's visible to the participant versus the card that's hidden from the participant and inferred. We actually, yeah. I don't know. What's your intuition?
I think I'm still forming my intuition, but yeah, I was just kind of curious if because I could imagine it maybe both ways. Like I could imagine like further up that gradient that it would be more representative of like the advisor's knowledge, but self-knowledge is also getting integrated. So
yeah, I think I'm most familiar with this gradient in the context of prosocial choice, like whether you are considering your own preferences to make decisions for yourself versus like actively making preferences for somebody else based on choices for somebody else based on their preferences. I'm trying to think about like how to apply that logic in the context of social learning, where the thing that you're representing is not I guess like some like basis that changes depending, but rather like your own knowledge versus somebody else's knowledge. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, like maybe the like equivalent reference frame, or like the kind of like equivalent to choosing for oneself versus choosing for others would be like learning from somebody else versus providing information to somebody else. That's actually related to something that I've been working on in my postdoc recently. I've also started looking at how teachers represent the beliefs of a learner when they're deciding what evidence to provide. So kind of Bayesian models of pedagogy propose that teachers choose evidence to communicate to a learner by kind of actively anticipating how the learner's beliefs will change in response to some evidence. But I think maybe this statement is a little bit outdated as of like a few weeks ago, but there's actually very little evidence of that kind of like these beliefs or like these belief representations being implemented anywhere in the brain. So teaching is another way to kind of like tie formal models of theory of mind and mental state inferences to their underlying biological implementation. So we've been looking at like how basically, like, for example, like whether regions in theory of mind network represent the learner's beliefs given new evidence, and whether those beliefs are updated over subsequent examples, things like that. But it'd be interesting to see, I guess, like if you had a task for somebody as a learner and a teacher at the same time or in different blocks, to directly look for the kind of like similarities or differences between those representations. Because I think like informal models of social learning versus teaching, like the basic idea is that they're nested and like the inferences of the teacher and the learner mutually constrain one another. So those models might predict that there's like a fair degree of overlap. That went like down quite a road, but I hope that starts to address your question.
It does, thank you. And yeah, that postdoc work sounds interesting. I'll have to keep an eye out for it.
I had a quick question that was sort of, I think, kind of similar to Allison's, but I mean, first of all, I just think this work is so cool that you can decode you know, the level of knowledge of the advisor. But I was wondering if you saw univariate differences between those different conditions within the VMPFC.
Oh, interesting.
One thing I was thinking was like Jason Mitchell, for example, at least used to argue that VMPFC activity reflected like simulation social cognition, using yourself as a model to understand others. So I wonder if that's part of the reason why those two conditions look similar to one another.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a really interesting connection. I mean, like the way that I've been thinking about it is that like maybe VMPFC is kind of like condensing kind of information within the task into some value signal that's relevant to choice. And so it would make sense to me that there's this kind of compression between like the thing that the hidden condition and the both condition have in common is that there's this additional channel of information that's also useful, like beyond just taking the value of your own card, you can also make use of this advice. Yeah, that's but I don't know if that like it would necessarily follow from that there would be univariate differences. I mean, I guess like you could look at basically like whether there's a relationship between the expected value of the hidden card and the MPFC activity and whether that relationship differs between conditions. Yeah, that seems totally doable. Thanks for the suggestion. Cool. Okay, so beyond just learning from others' choices, we can also learn a lot from their preferences, that is, from the things that they say they like. And not everything that we learn from other people has to do with discovering rewards. So to give you a simple example, suppose that you meet a new colleague and you discover that you both love the same coffee shop. If we just cared about discovering rewards, this information would be totally useless because there would be no point in discussing something that you already know and already like. But observing other people's preferences doesn't just tell us what's good to choose, it can also help us learn about the person doing the choosing. So when we observe somebody's preferences, we learn far more than what they like. For one, person's preferences reveal a person's knowledge. In order to like this coffee shop, you need to have tried it first. And preferences are also shaped by the communities and social groups to which that person belongs. So for example, I haven't physically been at my postdoc institution because of the pandemic, but I've heard that this coffee shop is very popular there. And so if I meet somebody who likes this coffee shop, I might infer that they've spent some time there. And what's remarkable about humans is that we can have preferences for just about anything, and just about any preference can serve as a badge of social identity. So for example, you might feel a deep kinship towards somebody who goes to the same coffee shop as you, or judge their character based on their taste in podcasts, even though coffee shops and podcasts are all evolutionarily novel and mundane things. So how do these kind of mundane and novel preferences come to be socially meaningful? Well, one way is that we can tell people which preferences are important and generalizable through language. So for example, if children hear a generic statement, like Gazorps like baba berries, they'll not only assume that this property generalizes to other members of this group, but they'll also enforce it and penalize group members who don't have this preference. My work focuses on a second and complementary route, which is that we can also discover which preferences are important and generalizable by tracking the statistics of the social environment. And in particular, in this first study, we asked whether children use people's preferences to diagnose their social identity. So can they use statistical information about how preferences are distributed across groups to infer which group a new individual belongs to? So in the study, we introduced participants to novel agents called Gazorps. Gazorps can belong to two different groups. Some Gazorps are on the blue team and some Gazorps are on the red team. And in this game, participants learned what gazorps like to eat. So gazorps can have one of two fruits at snack time. They can have kikis, which look like this, or they can have babas, which look like this. And in the version of this task that was designed for 4 and 5-year-olds, we sang a snack time song to help them keep track of what was going on. And prepare your ears, I am not a singer, but the snack time song goes something like this. Let's see what the blue team likes. This blue gazorp likes baba. One blue gazorp likes baba. Let's see what the blue team likes. This blue gazorp likes baba. 2 blue gazorps like baba, baba. You get the idea. It's not Baby Shark, but it does help keep children engaged during what would otherwise be a very boring and repetitive task. So then we introduced participants to a new gazorp and asked them to make some inference about them. So for example, we tell participants, look, this is a whole new gazorp. This gazorp lost its shirt, so we don't know what team this gazorp is on. But oh, look, this gazorp likes baba. Is this gazorp on the blue team or the red team? Blue team, show of hands. Yeah, so you just completed one variant of this task, which I'll call infer group. So in this variant, we told participants what this gazorp likes and asked them to infer whether this gazorp is on the blue team or the red team. And in another variant, which I'll call infer preference, we showed them what this gazorp, what team this gazorp is on and asked them whether this gazorp likes kiki or baba. And within each of these two variants of the task, we manipulated how preferences for these items were distributed across the two teams in order to manipulate the evidence that participants have to support each of these two inferences. So in the examples that you see here on the screen, liking baba is both unique to the blue team and unanimously shared by members of that team. So if you meet a new gazorp who likes baba, you can confidently infer that it's on the blue team. And if you meet a new gazorp who's on the blue team, you can confidently infer that it likes baba. Well, we formalize these intuitions using a Bayesian beta binomial model. So just to walk you through the intuitions of the model assumes that the preferences that we've observed in each team are random samples from 2 independent binomial processes. So you can think of this as flipping 2 biased coins where the blue team has a weight of theta blue and the red team has a weight of theta red. Now, the model doesn't know these weights in advance, and it has to infer them from the evidence. So before the model's observed any choices, it has a uniform prior over these weights. And as it observes more and more choices in each team, it updates its beliefs. So in this case, the model's seen that every gazorp on the blue team chose baba. And so it infers that the underlying probability of choosing baba is fairly high. And so if we meet a new gazorp on the blue team and we want to infer its preferences, this is all we need to do. We just flip the coin one more time, sample from this posterior distribution to generate a new prediction. But if we meet a new gazorp who likes baba and we want to infer its group membership, then we can't just look at the preferences of one team. We instead have to compare the distributions across both teams. So in order to infer group membership, the model entertains 2 competing hypotheses. This gazorp could be on the blue team or it could be on the red team. And because both teams are of the same size, these 2 hypotheses have the same prior probability. And so what really drives the model's predictions is the likelihood of observing this choice in either of the 2 teams. So for example, in this case, the likelihood of choosing baba is higher in the blue team, and so that's where the model predicts that this gazorp should go. So in addition to this unique and unanimous condition, we had 2 more conditions where one of these inferences was harder than the other. So in one condition, liking baba was unique to the blue team, but not unanimously shared by members of that team. And so if you meet a new gazorp who likes baba, you can confidently infer that it's on the blue team. But if you meet a new gazorp who's on the blue team, you might have no idea what its preferences are. And in the last condition, liking baba was unanimously shared by members of the blue team, but not unique to that team. And so if you meet a new gazorp who likes baba, this inference in particular might be trickier for children to do because liking baba isn't uniquely or deterministically associated with a single team. However, the likelihood of choosing baba is higher in the blue team. And so that's where the model predicts that this gazorp should go. And finally, if you meet a new gazorp who's on the blue team, you can confidently infer that it likes baba. Okay, so first, just as a baseline, let's look at what adults say on this task. So overall, We see that adults readily infer agents' group membership based on their preferences and their preferences based on their group membership. And adults choose the higher probability team or the higher probability fruit almost at ceiling. So they're choosing kind of greedily on this task. Now let's see what 4 and 5-year-olds say. So if we look at children's responses in the infer group task, we find that 4 and 5-year-olds can use an individual's preferences to infer their group membership, even in the subtle case where that preference isn't uniquely or deterministically associated with a single group. And so overall, we find that children can use preferences to diagnose group identity when they have the appropriate evidence to support it. Now, if we look at their responses in the infer preference task, 2 things stick out. The first is that in 2 of the 3 conditions, the model provides a good qualitative and quantitative fit to children's responses. But what really sticks out is that there is a case where children's responses and the model diverge. And that's this case where liking Baba is unanimously shared by members of the blue team, but is not unique to that team. So we're kind of puzzled by what's going on in this condition. Because everybody in this condition, everybody on the blue team likes the same thing. And so just like in the unique and unanimous condition, the model strongly expects that other members of the blue team will have the same preference. Children, on the other hand, generalize this preference to new group members in one condition, but not the other. And really the only thing that differs between these 2 conditions is the preferences of the opposing team. Now, to the model, the preferences of the opposing team are completely irrelevant because it assumes that the 2 teams are independent of one another. So whatever it observes in the red team has no bearing on its beliefs about the blue team. And so it's possible that in order to capture the full range of children's intuitions on this task, we may need to add an additional layer of abstraction to the model. That is not just independent hypotheses about individual groups, but also over hypotheses about how the groups were generated and how they relate to one another. So the basic intuition here is, for example, is that observing the preferences of the red team might lend support to over hypotheses where preferences can be heterogeneous within groups. And so seeing the preferences of the red team might temper children's expectations about how consistent preferences are within the blue team. And in ongoing work, we've been testing this hypothesis in a few different ways, for example, by providing different cover stories about how these groups came to be. So in one condition, for example, we tell participants that these groups are natural kinds. They're different species of gazorp that live on different planets, and some foods that are safe for blue gazorps can make red gazorps very sick, and vice versa. In another condition, we tell them that these groups came to be accidentally. So all gazorps live on the same planet and go to the same school. One day somebody was painting the school and there was a big paint spill. So some gazorps got splashed with blue paint and some got splashed with red paint. And what this manipulation achieves is that it provides information that these groups are meaningful categories that are statistically independent of one another, or that they're random categories that are non-independent. And in the interest of time, if we have a few minutes left over and you want to see the results, please let me know. But so far, what we find is that preschoolers can use minimal information about social groups to infer the preferences and group membership of new individuals. These results are surprising because past work would suggest that children should have trouble diagnosing group membership at all. So in past work, for example, if children were told, say that girls have a substance called estro in their bodies and boys have a substance called andro in their bodies, they would readily infer that other children who are girls have estro in their bodies, but not that children who have estro in their bodies are girls. And our work suggests that it's not so much that these inferences are inherently harder for children as that they're not always supported. So for example, in this case, boys and girls belong to the same species, and so their bodies are mostly made up of the same stuff. But when children do get appropriate evidence to support these inferences, they can infer new individuals' group membership, even in relatively subtle cases. And in ongoing work, we're testing whether these inferences are sensitive not just to statistics within groups, but also to relationships across groups. In this work, we've been testing children's abilities to draw inferences about social groups in a really minimal and supportive context where they're learning about novel social groups that have nothing to do with them, and where the properties that they're learning about are fairly neutral. One key future direction is to study how kids learn about the social groups around them. So for example, my honors thesis student, Denise Lopez Sosa, is studying how children use these statistics to learn about the competence of social groups. And in particular, down the line, we're interested in how children use others' expectations towards the groups that they belong to. So for example, their beliefs about the competence of girls to learn something about themselves and to choose which challenges to pursue. Wow, time is flying by. So just to quickly gesture at something, in another line of work, we've also examined whether adults use statistical information to discover like-minded people. And in particular, we find evidence that when given the choice, people prefer to affiliate with other people who share rare preferences with them, rather than with people who share more widespread preferences. And they also endorse affiliation between individuals who share rare preferences with one another. So the basic intuition, for example, if you're an animation geek like me, you might be more excited to meet somebody who likes a relatively obscure movie, like say Secret of Cows, rather than somebody who likes The Lion King. So overall, we find empirical evidence for this rare preference effect, and we also find evidence that people's use of statistical information to make these judgments is flexible and context dependent, and that it's most sensitive to, and then it's largely driven by the presence of shared knowledge. So liking the things, knowing about the same things as somebody else is more important than just liking those things in the absence of prior knowledge. Okay, so putting this all together, this work provides evidence that humans reason about others' choices and preferences by operating over representations, not just of individual minds, but also of the social world, so statistical regularities and relationships between people, and that they can use these inferences to discover rewards that would otherwise be invisible to them and to learn about new individuals they encounter. So one question that's been on the back of my mind for years is, what is all this inferential machinery for? So what kinds of problems does human social cognition solve? So I want to close by telling you about one problem that I'm particularly passionate about, and that's the problem of collaboration. So to collaborate effectively with other people, we have to know an awful lot about them. The great power of collaborations is that they combine the efforts of different minds. So for example, in scientific collaborations, we work with people that have different research interests, different skills, different degrees of experience that are enmeshed in different scientific relationships. But in order to make the most of collaborations, there's an awful lot that we need to know about our collaborators. For example, we have to understand what other people know, what they like and want, and how they're connected to one another. And so a major focus of my research is to examine how individuals use these kind of basic mechanisms of human social cognition, this inferential machinery that we've been talking about, to solve the thorny problems of effectively anticipating their collaborators' actions and coordinating with other people. However, I believe that even if we understood what individuals do perfectly, we'd still be missing an important piece of the puzzle of collaboration, because collaborations happen within communities. And so any solution to the puzzle of collaboration should address not just how individuals solve the challenges of collaboration, but also how the structure of communities contributes to the success of collaborations. So in my ongoing work, I've been interested in looking at collaboration through these two levels of analysis. So for example, how do individuals reason about competence? So what I can do, what you can do, how we complement each other. How do we use these beliefs to effectively divide labor with other people? And how much of these decisions do we get right? And how do we do all of these inferences and coordinate with other people, given the limited time and computational resources available to us? At the community level, I've been using naturalistic data sets to study collaborations at the level of whole communities. So I've been looking, for example, at player behavior at in this multiplayer online game called 1 Hour, 1 Life, where players can build complex societies entirely from scratch to gain a window into how communities collectively navigate the balance between exploiting available technologies to maintain the whole and exploring and developing new ones. And if any of this sounds interesting to you, or if you're interested in collaboration more broadly, I am launching a lab in 2 years. So if you're thinking of maybe starting a new phase of your career then, and this sounds interesting to you, please come talk to me. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening. And I have a few more minutes after this, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, I have a question. I really love your talk, and the sketches are really cool. And so my question is kind of general. So I wonder, does the feedback necessarily come from a people? So because in your first experiment, you said 3 individuals says maybe it's not a human. So I wonder if the results from those are different from others. And one related question to that is, so in your MVPA, you only use the ROI analysis to looking at those ROI. So I wonder if you do a searchlight to, so if it's not just about social or people, maybe there are other regions pop out.
Yeah, that's interesting. So first, to answer your first question, we didn't we didn't give participants like a super rich backstory in the online tasks. So the behavior only tasks that you just saw, we just told them like, this is the advisor, you're going to be working on them through the game. Anecdotally, when people give us feedback about the advisor, some people use this kind of like robotic language, like, oh, the advisor's algorithm was really inefficient, or but sometimes, especially we had additional experiments where we paired participants with advisors that were actively unhelpful. We had people say things like, I think this advisor is drunk, or this advisor does not know how to play this game at all and should not be allowed to give advice, things like that. So there's like some degree of personification. I think the strongest evidence, to speak to your question, is in the fMRI version of this task. We explicitly asked participants how confident they were that the advice that they received came from a real human, and the majority of our participants believed that it did. And when we asked them to explain, features of the task that made them either more convinced or less convinced that they were interacting with a human, the answers that they gave were totally idiosyncratic. So for example, there were a few trials where, say, the advisor told participants to switch, and they had like a 3, which is not a fantastic card, and like some participants used that as evidence that this was not a human, like, oh, a human would never give me this advice, and other people use this as strong evidence that it was a human, because like, oh, a human wouldn't give the perfect advice every time, sometimes they press the wrong button. So there's some evidence to speak to your question. The second, about the ROI analysis, we have been planning to do a searchlight with these data, but I think, the hypothesis space for these kinds of analyses is so vast that we wanted to start with regions where we can make kind of a priori predictions, and we can kind of like constrain our analyses a little bit. And so I guess like the nice thing about looking at theory of mind network specifically is that this adds to kind of a growing body of evidence that that these regions represent abstract features of mental states, rather than being, maybe something totally idiosyncratic to our data.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Well, just join me again in thanking Natalia for this wonderful talk.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see all of you.
Great. Thanks again.